In the untamed expanse of the American West, where mercy is as rare as water in the desert, a young slave girl wanders alone. Betrayed by her own family and sold into bondage, she survives on the edges of civilization, haunted by bounty hunters and the harsh elements alike. Her spirit, though battered, refuses to break. When she collapses near a dried-up creek, fate intervenes in the form of a wealthy rancher returning from his cattle drive. In his eyes, she sees something she hasn't encountered in years: compassion. But in a land where trust comes at a deadly price, can a slave girl dare to believe in the kindness of a stranger? Could his offer of shelter be her path to freedom, or another cruel twist in her journey? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The smooth riverstone felt warm in Sarah's palm as she stumbled through the gathering dusk. Her fingers traced its weathered surface, a habit formed over weeks of solitary wandering. The stone was all she had left from the day her world shattered, the day her own flesh and blood had traded her freedom for a handful of coins. The memory rose unbidden, sharp as a knife. 3 months earlier, she'd awakened to find her uncle standing over her bed, his face a mask of false sympathy. "It's for the best, girl," he'd said, as 2 strange men bound her wrists. Her parents had died of fever the winter before, leaving her in his care. Now she understood why he'd been so quick to take her in. The torn bill of sale crinkled in her pocket as she walked. She'd managed to grab it during her escape, the paper now worn thin from countless readings. Sarah Williams, age 19, sound of body and mind. Her uncle's signature sprawled across the bottom, a final betrayal in faded ink. She'd run that first night, slipping away when the slave traders made camp. They'd been taking her west, to the territories where laws were loose and questions few. For 3 days, they'd hunted her through the hills, their horses' hoofbeats haunting her dreams. But Sarah had always been clever, staying in streams to mask her scent, moving only at night, eating berries and roots she remembered from her mother's teachings. The wilderness had been both sanctuary and torment. Each day brought new challenges: finding water, avoiding settlers who might turn her in, keeping warm as autumn's chill crept into the land. The stone had come from the first creek she'd drunk from, pocketed as a reminder that nature, at least, showed no prejudice. It gave and took from all equally. Her feet had long since worn through her shoes, leaving them little more than tattered. Rags bound with strips of bark. The dress she wore, once her best Sunday cloth, now hung in tatters, stained with mud and wild berries. But worse than the physical hardships was the loneliness, the crushing weight of being utterly alone in a vast and indifferent land. Some nights, huddled in makeshift shelters of branches and leaves, she would talk to herself just to remember the sound of human speech. She told herself stories her mother had shared, sang hymns in a whisper, recited the few passages of scripture she knew by heart. Anything to keep the silence at bay, to remember who she was, beyond property to be bought and sold. The few settlements she'd encountered offered little hope. She'd tried approaching one, early in her flight, driven by hunger and exhaustion. The woman who answered her knock had seemed kind at first, offering bread and water. But Sarah had seen the way her eyes narrowed at her ragged appearance, the calculating look as she asked too many questions. She'd fled before the woman could send for the sheriff, the half-eaten bread still clutched in her trembling hands. Time lost meaning. Days blurred together, marked only by the sun's passage and her growing desperation. She began to understand why the wild creatures she encountered moved as they did, always alert, always ready to flee. Like them, she had become a creature of instinct and survival, measuring each moment by its threat or promise of safety. The stone became her only constant companion. When fear threatened to overwhelm her, she would grip it tight, letting its solid presence anchor her to reality. It reminded her of the creek where she'd found it, of the brief moment of peace as she'd cupped clean water in her hands. Sometimes she imagined it held some of that creek's essence, sustaining her through the darkest hours. Now, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah's legs finally betrayed her. Weeks of inadequate food and endless walking had taken their toll. The dry creek bed seemed to waver before her eyes, the stones blurring into ghostly shapes in the fading light. Her throat burned with thirst. She hadn't found water since yesterday morning. As consciousness slipped away, she clutched her river stone tighter. Perhaps this was where her journey ended, alone in the wilderness, with only a smooth piece of earth for company. The irony didn't escape her. She'd won her freedom only to die from it, but at least she would die free, answering to no master but her own fierce will to survive. The last thing she saw before darkness took her was a cloud of dust on the horizon, backlit by the setting sun. In her delirium, it looked almost beautiful, like the trail of some great spirit moving across the land. Then everything faded to black, and Sarah Williams, no one's property but her own, surrendered to the encompassing night. James McCullough had seen his share of hard sights in 20 years of ranching, but the crumpled figure by the creek bed stopped him cold. He'd been pushing hard to get home before dark, his cattle drive finally complete, the silver canteen at his hip nearly empty after the long day's ride. Now, as his horse nickered softly in the gathering dusk, he found himself facing a choice that would alter the course of 2 lives. The girl couldn't have been more than 20, her dress more holes than fabric, feet wrapped in crude bandages made from tree bark. Even unconscious, her hand clutched something tight, a smooth river stone, he'd later learn, but it was her face that caught him, young yet weathered by hardship, telling a story he wasn't sure he wanted to know. His silver canteen caught the last rays of sunlight as he dismounted. It was an ornate thing, a gift from his late wife Catherine, engraved with wild roses and his initials. Every man needs something beautiful in this harsh land, she'd told him. Now kneeling beside the unconscious girl, he uncapped it and let a few drops fall between her cracked lips. Her eyes fluttered open, wide with fear, before focusing on the canteen. The naked desperation in her gaze made his chest tight. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of hunted things. "Easy now," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "You're safe. I'm not going to hurt you." She tried to speak, but could only manage a dry cough. James held the canteen steady as she drank, noting how she tried to gulp despite her weakness. "Slow," he cautioned. "Too much at once will make you sick." When she'd had enough to wet her and throat, she pulled back, wariness replacing desperation. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. She clutched her stone tighter, as if drawing strength from it. "James McCullough," he offered, not pushing for her name. Trust came hard in the territories, and something told him this girl had earned her caution. "My ranch is about 3 hours' ride from here. You need food, proper water, and rest. Not necessarily in that order." She stiffened at the mention of his ranch, trying to push herself up on trembling arms. I couldn't impose. You've been kind enough already." The formality in her tone struck him, educated despite her current state. "It's not an imposition," he said, watching her carefully. "And it's not a trap either. You're free to leave whenever you choose." He saw something flicker in her eyes at the word free, and understood a little more of her story. The sun had nearly set now, painting the sky in deep purples and fading gold. Night would bring cold, and she was in no condition to survive it. They both knew it, but he waited, letting her come to the decision on her own. Finally she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Sarah." She hesitated, then added, "Just Sarah." The omission of a surname told its own story. James nodded, accepting what she offered without pressing for more. "Well, just Sarah, my horse is strong enough to carry us both, and I've got beans and bread in my saddlebag. We can rest here while you get some food in you, then ride to the ranch after moonrise." He moved slowly as he gathered wood for a small fire, keeping his movements deliberate and open. Sarah watched him with the intensity of someone used to studying others for signs of danger. The flames caught quickly, and soon he was heating beans in a small pan, tearing his travel bread into manageable pieces. As she ate, slowly at first, then with carefully controlled hunger, James found himself studying her in the firelight. There was a dignity in her bearing that hardship hadn't erased, a stubborn flame of self-possession that spoke of inner strength. It reminded him painfully of Catherine. "My ranch," he said as she finished eating, "is a quiet place. 10 miles to the nearest neighbor, 20 to town. Just me, my foreman Luis, and a couple of ranch hands who keep to themselves." He wasn't sure why he was telling her this, except that she seemed to need to know there wouldn't be many eyes on her. Sarah set aside her empty plate, her movements precise despite her exhaustion. "Why are you helping me, Mr. McCullough?" It was a fair question, one he'd been asking himself since he first spotted her. He could have ridden on, left her for the next traveler to find, or reported her to the sheriff in town, letting the law decide her fate. The smart thing, probably. The safe thing, certainly. Instead, he touched the silver canteen at his hip, thinking of Catherine's words about beauty in harsh places. "Because 20 years ago, someone helped me when I was at my lowest, gave me a chance when I hadn't earned it. Maybe it's time I passed that kindness on." He saw her process this, weighing his words against her experiences, measuring the risk against her desperate situation. Finally, she nodded, a decision reached. "I can work," she said. "I'm strong, and I learn quickly." "We'll talk about all that once you're properly rested," he replied, standing to saddle his horse. "For now, let's just focus on getting you somewhere safe." As he helped her mount, he noticed she still hadn't let go of her riverstone. Some talismans, he knew, carried power beyond their physical form. He wouldn't ask her about it. Not yet. There would be time for stories later, if she chose to share them. The moon rose as they rode west, casting long shadows across the empty land. Sarah sat stiffly in front of him, fighting exhaustion, still alert for danger. But gradually, as the miles passed in silence, he felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. Perhaps she was too tired to maintain her guard. Or perhaps, despite everything, something in her recognized a kindred spirit, another soul who knew what it was to be remade by the harsh beauty of this unforgiving land. The McCullough Ranch materialized out of the darkness like a dream. First the fence line, then the looming shape of the main house, its windows dark against the star-filled sky. Sarah felt James shift behind her, reaching forward to guide. His horse through the gate. The creak of hinges seemed to echo across the empty yard, making her flinch despite her exhaustion. "Easy now," James murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everyone's asleep at this hour. We won't have to deal with questions until morning." He'd read her anxiety correctly. The thought of facing strangers, of being examined and judged, had been gnawing at her throughout their ride. The house was larger than she'd expected. 2 stories of solid construction with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. A home built to last, to shelter generations. Sarah couldn't remember the last time she'd slept under such a sturdy roof. Her uncle's house had been little more than a cabin, and since then, she pushed the memories away. James helped her dismount, steadying her when her legs threatened to give way. The stone was still clutched in her hand, its familiar surface grounding her in this unfamiliar place. She watched as he led his horse to the barn, his movements sure even in the darkness. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. When he returned, he was carrying a small brass key that caught the moonlight. "Back doors." "Quieter," he explained, leading her around to the kitchen entrance. "Less likely to wake Luis, he's a light sleeper." The key turned smoothly in the lock, speaking of well-maintained order. The kitchen was a spacious room, neat but lived in. Copper pots hung from ceiling hooks, their surfaces reflecting dim patches of moonlight. A large wood stove dominated one wall, its iron bulk somehow comforting in its solidity. Sarah stood just inside the doorway, uncertain, as James lit a small lamp. "Sit," he said gently, pulling out one of the sturdy kitchen chairs. "You look dead on your feet." He moved around the kitchen with practiced ease, filling a kettle with water from a pump at the sink. "Tea first, then we'll see about getting you settled." Sarah sank into the chair, her body reminding her of every mile she'd walked, every night spent on hard ground. The wooden seat felt like luxury after so long. She set her river stone on the table, reluctant to let it go completely, but needing both hands to wrap around the warm cup James offered her. "It's not much," he said, setting out a plate of cold biscuits and dried apple slices. "We'll do better at breakfast." He took a seat across from her, his own cup untouched. "There's a room upstairs. Was my daughter's long ago. Clean sheets. On the bed, window faces east. It'll be yours as long as you need it." The tea was sweet with honey, the biscuits fresh enough to suggest they'd been baked that morning. Sarah ate slowly, trying to maintain proper manners despite her hunger. "A daughter's room," he'd said, but no daughter was in evidence, nor any sign of a woman's touch in the kitchen. More stories waited there, but she was too tired to puzzle them out. "Your foreman," she said finally, her voice still rough despite the tea. "And the ranch hands. Will they—" She trailed off, unsure how to voice her fears without giving offense. "Luis has been with me 15 years, James replied, understanding her unspoken question. "His own story isn't so different from yours, though he'd have to be the one to share it. The hands are seasonal workers, more concerned with their pay than anyone's business, but if any of them give you trouble, they'll answer to me." He spoke with quiet certainty, as if protecting fugitive slaves was something he did every day. Perhaps it was. The territories attracted all sorts, including those who'd appointed themselves guardians of others' freedom. But Sarah had learned the hard way that good intentions didn't always translate to good actions. "Why did you really stop?" she asked, the question that had been burning since he first offered her water. Most would have ridden past, or worse. James was silent for a long moment, turning his cup between his hands. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief. 20 years ago, I lost my wife and daughter to cholera. Catherine, my wife. She was forever bringing home strays. Lost dogs, injured birds, people down on their luck. The world's hard enough, she'd say, without us making it harder. After she died, he shook his head. I forgot that for a while. Forgot a lot of things. But sometimes God sends us reminders of who we're supposed to be. The lamp flickered, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Outside, an owl called, its cry carrying clearly in the still night. Sarah wrapped her hands tighter around her cup, absorbing his words. She'd known good people before. Her parents had been kind, loving souls. But kindness without strength rarely survived in this harsh land. James McCullough seemed to have both in equal measure. "The room," she said finally. "I can't pay for it, not yet. But I meant what I said about working. I'm not looking for charity." "No," he agreed. "You're looking for sanctuary. There's a difference." He stood, picking up the lamp. "Come on, you look about ready to fall off that chair." The stairs creaked softly under their feet as he led her to the second floor. The room he showed her was small but neat, with a narrow bed and a wooden dresser. A colorful quilt covered the bed. Handmade, she could tell at a glance. More story there, but it could wait. "Bathroom's down the hall," James said, setting the lamp on the dresser. "Locks on the inside of the door. Window latch works, and there's a branch of the old oak tree right outside if you need a quick way out." He said it matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather rather than escape routes. "Sleep as long as you need. We'll talk more tomorrow." He left her with the lamp and the key to the bedroom door, a simple brass thing, matching the one he'd used on the kitchen entrance. Sarah turned it over in her hands after he'd gone, feeling its weight. Such a small thing, a key. But it meant choices, privacy, the ability to shut the world out or let it in on her own terms. She set her river stone on the windowsill where the morning sun would warm it. Then, for the first time in months, Sarah Williams lay down on a real bed, in a room with a lock she controlled, and allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, Her luck had finally turned. Dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold when Sarah woke, momentarily disoriented by the softness of the bed beneath her. Her river stone caught the early light on the windowsill, reassuring her with its familiar presence. The events of the previous night came back slowly. The rescue, the midnight ride, the quiet kitchen with its copper pots and promise of safety. The leather-bound journal lay where James had left it on the dresser, its cover worn smooth with age. "For your letters," he'd said at breakfast, sliding it across the table after Luis and the ranch hands had gone about their morning duties. "My Catherine used it for her thoughts. Seems right it should help someone else find their voice." Now, sitting cross-legged on the bed, Sarah ran her fingers over the journal's cover. Inside, most pages were blank, though a few at the beginning held faded writing in an elegant hand, Catherine's recipes, household accounts, and brief observations about ranch life. The rest waited for Sarah's own story, once she learned to write it. "Start with your name," James had suggested, sitting beside her at the kitchen table. He'd shown her how to hold the pencil, his calloused hands gentle as he guided hers through the motions. Every story begins with a name. The letters had been awkward, childish, compared to Catherine's flowing script. But seeing them there, Sarah, written by her own hand, had stirred something deep inside her. Slaves weren't supposed to read or write. The power of written words belonged to masters, not property. Yet here she sat, tracing letters that spelled her own identity. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Breakfast's ready," Luis called, his voice kind but reserved. "Boss says to come down when you're dressed." She'd been wary of him at first, but his quiet efficiency and respectful distance had helped ease her fears. As James had promised, Luis asked no questions, though his dark eyes held understanding when they met hers. Sarah dressed quickly in the clothes James had found for her. Simple work dresses that must have belonged to Catherine, carefully preserved in cedar chests. They were slightly too large, but clean and sturdy. A far cry from the rags she'd arrived in, which Luis's wife had quietly taken away to burn. The kitchen smelled of coffee and frying bacon when she descended. James stood at the stove, his shirt sleeves rolled up as he tended a pan of eggs. "Sleep well?" he asked, not turning around. She'd noticed he did that, gave her space, avoided sudden movements, kept his body language open and predictable, small kindnesses that spoke of careful thought. "Yes, thank you." She took her seat at the table, the journal clutched in her lap. "I've been looking at the letters we practiced." "Good." He set a plate before her, eggs, bacon, thick slices of bread still warm from the oven. "We'll work on more after breakfast if you'd like, unless you'd rather help Luis with the horses. He mentioned you seemed interested when he was doing the morning feed." The choice was offered casually, but Sarah understood its significance. No orders, no expectations, just options, decisions she could make for herself. It was simultaneously freeing and terrifying. "Both?" she ventured. "Maybe horses first, then letters after lunch?" James nodded, a slight smile touching his weathered face. "Sounds sensible. Horses are good teachers in their own right. They know who they can trust, and they don't care about a person's past, only how they're treated in the present." The morning passed in a blur of new experiences. Luis showed her how to brush down the horses, explaining each animal's quirks and preferences. The repetitive motion of the curry comb was soothing, and the horse's quiet acceptance of her presence helped settle her nerves. One mare in particular, a gentle bay named Maple, seemed to take to her, nickering softly whenever Sarah approached her stall. "She's got good instincts, that one," Luis commented, watching them interact. "Boss bought her as a colt, right after—" He trailed off, but Sarah understood. Right after his family died. Another piece of the puzzle that was James McCullough. The afternoon found her back at the kitchen table, the journal open before her. James proved a patient teacher, breaking down each letter into simple strokes, sharing tricks for remembering their sounds. Writing's just drawing with purpose, he explained, and reading's like solving a puzzle. Once you know the pieces, the whole picture comes clear. But it wasn't just letters he was teaching her. Each word they worked on carried meaning beyond its spelling. Freedom was one of the first he helped her write, 6 letters that had shaped her entire life. Choice, strength, hope followed, a vocabulary of possibility written in her increasingly steady hand. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked during a break, flexing her cramped fingers. "Teaching me, I mean. It's dangerous for both of us." James was silent for a moment, gazing out the kitchen window at the distant mountains. "My daughter, Mary, would have been about your age," he said finally. "She was just learning her letters when the fever took her." Catherine used to say education was a light in dark places. After they died, I let that light go out for a long time. Maybe it's time to rekindle it. Sarah looked down at the journal, at the words she'd carefully printed beneath Catherine's elegant script. 2 women's stories sharing the same pages, separated by time but connected by this man's quiet determination to honor his wife's memory through acts of kindness. "There will be people looking for me," she said softly. "Not just the slave traders. My uncle has friends in the territories. If they find out I'm here, then we'll deal with that if it comes," James replied, his voice firm. "This land's seen its share of battles over who owns what or who, but some things aren't negotiable. A person's right to learn, to grow, to be free, those are God-given. Gifts no man has the right to take." The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, warming the pages of the journal. Sarah traced the letters of her name again, feeling their power. Each stroke was an act of defiance, a declaration that she was more than property to be bought and sold. She was a person with stories to tell, and now she was learning the tools to tell them. More than the physical sanctuary of the ranch, more than the borrowed clothes and safe bed, it was this gift, the power of words, that made her begin to believe in the possibility of a real future. One where she could write her own story, make her own choices, be the author of her own life. The photograph fell from between the pages of Catherine's journal one rainy afternoon, a week into Sarah's stay at the ranch. She'd been practicing her letters in the study, taking advantage of the wet weather to work through the primer James had given her. The old daguerreotype slipped free as she turned a page, its silver surface catching the grey light from the window. 3 faces looked back at her from the tarnished image. James, younger and less weathered, standing behind a seated woman with kind eyes and an infant cradled in her arms. Catherine and Mary, the family he'd lost. Sarah stared at their faces, feeling like an intruder in their frozen moment of happiness. "That was taken in town, spring of '53, James said from the doorway, making her start. She hadn't heard him come in. "Only photograph we ever had made," Catherine insisted. Said memories fade, but pictures hold on to the truth. Sarah moved to return the photograph, but James shook his head. "No need. I've been meaning to bring it out anyway. Some stories are easier to tell with proof in hand." He crossed to the fireplace, stirring the embers before adding another log. The rain drummed steadily against the windows, creating a cocoon of privacy around them. "It was cholera," he said quietly, settling into his armchair. "Came through like a wildfire in the dry season. Started in town, spread to the outlying farms. Catherine insisted on helping nurse the sick. It was her way. Couldn't stand to see suffering without trying to ease it." He paused, his eyes distant. "Mary fell ill first. Just a baby, not even 2 years old. Catherine wouldn't leave her side even when the doctor warned her about contagion." Sarah set the photograph carefully on the desk, the weight of James's grief filling the room. She'd seen that kind of loss before, had felt it herself when her parents died. Some wounds never fully healed. You just learned to carry them. "I was away when it happened," James continued, his voice rough. "Driving cattle to the railhead in Kansas. By the time I got word and made it back..." He trailed off, but Sarah could fill in the rest. Too late for goodbyes, too late for anything but burying the dead and learning to live with absence. "My Mother used to say that grief is the price we pay for love, Sarah offered softly. When the fever took her and Papa, my uncle said I was lucky he took me in. I didn't feel lucky then. Still don't, knowing what he had planned all along. Lightning flickered outside, followed by a low rumble of thunder. James stood, moving to pour 2 cups of coffee from the pot he'd brought with him. "Tell me," he said, handing her a cup, "if you want to." The coffee was hot and sweet, just as she'd come to prefer it. Sarah wrapped her hands around the cup, drawing comfort from its warmth. They were free people. My parents had papers to prove it going back 2 generations. Papa worked as a carpenter. Mama took in sewing. We weren't rich, but we had enough. She paused, sipping her coffee. When they got sick, it happened fast. Like your Catherine and Mary. One day Mama was hemming dresses. The next she could barely stand. Papa tried to care for her, caught the fever himself. Outside, the storm grew stronger, rain lashing against the windows. Inside, the fire crackled steadily, holding back the growing darkness. Uncle Marcus showed up at the funeral, Sarah continued. Papa's younger brother, though you'd never know it by looking at them. Papa was all about honest work and helping others. Uncle Marcus, she shook her head. He had schemes, always looking for easy money, but he was my only kin left. And I was 17 with no other options. He waited a year, she said, her voice bitter. Let me grieve. Let me trust him. Then one morning I woke up to strange men in the house and my whole world turned upside down. He'd sold me, his own blood, for $200 and a piece of land he wanted. Her hands tightened around the coffee cup. Found out later the papers he showed the slave traders were forged. My real freedom papers were in his desk. All along, but by then I was already being moved west. James listened without interrupting, his face grave in the firelight. When she finished, he set his cup down with deliberate care. Your uncle, he said, his voice carefully controlled. Does he know where you are? Sarah shook her head. I don't think so. The traders were taking me to Arizona territory, said they had a buyer there. I ran before we crossed the border. She hesitated, then added, but he has friends out here, traders, land speculators. If word gets back to him, then we'll deal with it, James said firmly. I meant what I said about this being sanctuary. He stood, crossing to a cabinet near his desk. From it, he withdrew a wooden box she hadn't seen before. Speaking of which, there's something you should know. The box contained papers, letters, legal documents, carefully preserved newspaper clippings. After Catherine and Mary died, he explained, sorting through them, I spent some time working with the Underground Railroad, moving people to safety, helping them establish new lives, made some useful connections along the way. Sarah's eyes widened as understanding dawned. That's why you stopped for me, why you weren't surprised by my story. James nodded, withdrawing a particular document. I have friends in California. Good people with experience helping folks like yourself start fresh. If you want, when you're stronger, we can arrange passage. New name, new papers, new life. He paused, then added quietly, or you can stay. Here, choice is yours. The photograph still lay on the desk, Catherine's kind eyes seeming to watch them both. Sarah thought about choices, how few she'd had lately, how precious each one felt now. The rain continued its steady rhythm, counterpoint to the crackling fire and her own thundering heart. I'd like to stay, she said finally, at least for now. I need to learn more, reading, writing, managing on my own, and she hesitated, then continued, I feel safe here. For the first time since my parents died, I feel like I can breathe. James nodded, returning the papers to their box. Then that's settled. He glanced at the photograph, a soft smile touching his lips. Catherine would have liked you, you know. She always said God puts people in our path for a reason. Sometimes to help them, sometimes to let them help us. Thunder rolled again, closer now, but Sarah barely noticed. She was looking at the photograph, at the family captured there in silver and light. Catherine's words about pictures holding truth echoed in her mind. This image held one truth, a happy family torn apart by tragedy. but perhaps new truths could be written, new stories begun. Like the blank pages in Catherine's journal, the future waited to be filled. The old training saddle wasn't much to look at. Its leather worn smooth by years of use, brass fittings dulled with age. But as Sarah ran her hands over its surface in the pre-dawn light, she felt the weight of its promise. James had brought it down from the tack room's upper shelf, dust motes dancing in the lantern light, as he explained its history. "Catherine used this to teach Mary her first lessons," he said, checking the cinch straps with practiced care. "Before that, it helped a dozen ranch hands' children learn their seat. Simple design, deep wells to help you stay centered. We'll start with this before moving you to a regular saddle." Maple stood patiently in the cross ties, her bay coat gleaming. From Sarah's careful grooming, the mare had become her constant companion over the past weeks, following her along the fence line when Sarah did her chores, nickering greetings whenever she entered the barn. "Remember," James said as he helped her mount, "a horse can sense fear or uncertainty. They mirror what we give them. Confidence flows down the reins. You stay calm, they stay calm." His hands were steady on the saddle as Sarah settled herself, finding her balance in this new perspective on the world. The training ring was still damp with morning dew as they began their first lesson. James led Maple on a long line, teaching Sarah the rhythm of posting to the trot, the subtle shifts of weight that could communicate intention to her mount. "Your body talks to the horse," he explained. "Every muscle, every breath, they read it all." Hours passed as Sarah learned this new language of movement and trust. Her thighs ached, unused to straddling such width, and sweat dampened her shirt despite the cool morning air. But with each circle of the ring, each successful transition from walk to trot and back again, she felt something blooming inside her chest. A fierce joy she hadn't known she was capable of feeling anymore. "Good," James called as she managed her first solo trot, the training saddle keeping her secure as Maple moved beneath her. "Now you're getting it. Feel how she responds to your seat. That's partnership, not dominance. Best riders work with their horses, not over them." The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist as they worked. Louise appeared occasionally, offering quiet suggestions about hand position or the angle of her elbows. By mid-morning, Sarah's muscles trembled with effort, but her spirit soared. This was freedom of a different sort, the ability to move under her own power, to direct her path with subtle cues and earn trust. "Enough for today," James finally called, noting her fatigue. "Better to stop while you're both still fresh. Plenty of time to build on these basics." He helped her dismount, steadying her when her legs wobbled beneath her. "You did well, both of you did." Sarah leaned against Maple's warm shoulder, breathing in the honest scent of horse and leather. "It's different than I expected," she admitted. "When I used to watch the slave traders on their horses, it seemed like it was all about control, forcing the animal to submit." James nodded, beginning to untack Maple with practiced efficiency. "That's how some see it. Same way some see other people, as things to be controlled rather than souls to be understood." He handed her a curry comb. "But real horsemanship, like real friendship, is built on mutual respect. Take care of them, they'll take care of you." The lessons continued each morning, weather permitting. Sarah learned to groom, to tack up her own mount, to read Maple's moods in the flick of an ear or the swish of her tail. The training saddle became her safe space as she progressed from walk to trot, then finally to her first tentative canter. "You're a natural," Louise commented one morning, watching her navigate an impromptu obstacle course of barrels in the ring. "Some people fight the horse's movement. You flow with it." His dark eyes held approval and something else, understanding perhaps of what this growing skill meant to her. Between riding lessons, Sarah threw herself into other ranch work with equal determination. James taught her to mend fences, to read weather signs in the sky, to calculate feed requirements for the growing herd. Each new skill was another thread in the tapestry of independence she was weaving for herself. My father believed education came in many forms, she told James one evening as they reviewed the ranch's books together. He said knowing how to read was important, but knowing how to read people, animals, and the land was just as vital. James looked up from the ledger, his expression thoughtful. Wise man, your father. Out here, survival depends on all those kinds of reading. He tapped the page before them. Numbers tell one kind of story, but there's truth in the way a horse moves, the way clouds build before a storm, the way people hold themselves when they're speaking. Sarah nodded, thinking of all she'd learned to read lately. Not just words and numbers, but the language of the ranch itself. The way the cattle bunched before a storm, how the chickens went quiet when a hawk circled overhead, the subtle signs that told of approaching riders long before they appeared. One morning, about a month into her training, James led out a different saddle, newer, lighter, tooled with intricate patterns. Time to move up, he said, helping her secure it on. Maple's back. You've outgrown the training saddle. Sarah ran her hands over the new leather, appreciating its workmanship. Are you sure? What if I'm not ready? You're ready, he assured her. Been ready for a while now. Sometimes we hold onto training wheels longer than we need to, out of habit or fear. But there comes a time to trust what you've learned and take the next step. As she swung into the new saddle, feeling its different balance and lighter weight, Sarah thought about steps and trust and progress. The training saddle had taught her more than just riding. It had shown her that she could learn, could grow, could master new skills despite her past. Where to? She asked, gathering her reins with newfound confidence. James mounted his own horse, a smile touching his weathered face. Let's try the north pasture. Time you saw more of the ranch than just the training ring. He paused, then added, just remember, if you get uncertain, trust your instincts. They haven't led you wrong so far. They rode out together into the brightening morning, the training saddle hanging retired in the tack room behind them. Another chapter finished, Sarah thought, another skill mastered. Not just riding, but the harder lesson of trusting herself. Each day brought new challenges, new opportunities to learn and grow. And with each success, the frightened girl who had collapsed by a dry creek bed seemed more like a distant memory. Someone she had been, but not who she was becoming. The general store receipt crinkled in Sarah's pocket as she and James rode through the dusty streets of Silver Creek. Even on paper, the insult was clear. Negro girls' purchases scrawled across the top in the shopkeeper's spidery hand, with prices marked up nearly double the posted amounts. James had seen it too, his jaw tightening as he'd wordlessly paid the inflated sum. They'd delayed this trip into town as long as possible, but the ranch needed supplies that couldn't be postponed any longer. James had chosen a quiet Tuesday morning, hoping to avoid the weekend crowds. Sarah rode Maple beside his stallion, wearing her best borrowed dress and a determined expression. Keep your head high, James had advised as they approached the town. Limits. You've as much right to be here as anyone. But they both knew rights and reality often walked separate paths in the territories. The trouble started at Whitaker's general store. Sarah had been carefully consulting her shopping list, written in her increasingly confident hand, when Mrs. Whitaker's shrill voice cut through the quiet shop. "Herbert, there's one of them in the store." Mr. Whitaker emerged from behind his counter, his thin face pinched with disapproval. "We don't serve their kind here," he announced, as if reading from an invisible sign. "Not without their owner present." "She's with me," James said quietly, materializing from between the shelves. His voice was calm, but Sarah recognized the steel beneath it. "And she's a free woman, Mr. Whitaker. I'll thank you to remember that." The storekeeper's face reddened. "Free, you say? Papers to prove it?" His eyes narrowed at Sarah. "Because Sheriff Miller was just talking about some runaways being reported in the territory. Dangerous folks harboring them, they say." James stepped forward, his presence suddenly filling the small store. "I've known you 15 years, Herbert. Bought supplies from you, recommended your store to others. Now I'm telling you plain. This woman is under my protection. Your choice how you want to handle that." The threat wasn't spoken aloud, but it hung in the air like thunderclouds before a storm. Mr. Whitaker shifted uncomfortably, then muttered, "Still have to charge extra. For the risk, you understand." "No, I don't understand," James replied, his voice still quiet, but carrying to every corner of the store. "But I'll pay your prices today, and then I'll make sure every rancher from here to the territory line knows exactly how you conduct business." The rest of the transaction proceeded in tense silence. Sarah kept her face composed, though her hands trembled slightly as she gathered their purchases. She'd expected resistance, but the naked hostility in Mrs. Whitaker's eyes stirred memories she'd rather have left buried. Outside, the street had grown more crowded. Word traveled fast in small towns, and their presence had drawn attention. A cluster of men gathered outside the saloon watched them with undisguised interest. Sarah felt their stares like physical things pressing against her skin. "McCullough," a voice called out. "Got yourself a new house girl, I see." The speaker pushed off the saloon wall. A heavy-set man with a deputy's badge and mean eyes. "Sheriff's been asking about runaways. Maybe we ought to have a talk about proper documentation." James turned slowly, positioning his horse between Sarah and the deputy. "Nothing to talk about, Burke, unless you're admitting the sheriff takes orders from slave hunters now. Might make interesting reading in the territorial paper." Other townspeople had stopped to watch the confrontation, forming a loose circle around them. Sarah sat straight in her saddle, one hand resting near the knife James had insisted she carry. She'd promised herself she'd never be taken again, would die first if it came to that. "Just doing our duty," Burke said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. James McCullough carried weight in these parts. His ranch employed a dozen men. His cattle drives brought good money to local businesses. Making an enemy of him would have consequences. "Your duty?" James's voice was deceptively mild. "Last I checked, your duty was to uphold the law. And the law says any person accused of being a runaway has the right to contest that claim in court, with proper representation, which I'm happy to provide, along with some interesting testimony about local law enforcement's connection to certain slave hunting operations." A murmur ran through the crowd. Burke's face darkened, but he took a step back. "No need for that kind of talk," he muttered. "Just making sure everything's proper is all." "Everything's proper," James assured him coldly. "And everything that happens on my ranch is my business. We clear on that, deputy?" The confrontation ended there, but Sarah felt the hostile eyes following them as they rode out of town. Only when Silver Creek's dust had faded behind them did she let her shoulders relax slightly. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I've made things difficult for you." James reined his horse closer to hers. "You haven't made anything difficult. They have, with their fear and ignorance." He paused, then added, "But they're not the whole town. There are good people here too. They're just quieter about it. Give it time." Sarah pulled the crumpled receipt from her pocket, studying the insulting notation. "Time won't change some minds. My father used to say prejudice was like rocky soil. Nothing good grows there without a lot of work breaking it up first." "Smart." "A man," James agreed. "But sometimes the work is worth doing, even if the harvest is slow in coming." He gestured at the rolling landscape ahead of them. "This ranch wasn't always good grazing land. Took years of clearing rocks, digging irrigation, planting grass before cattle could thrive here. Same principle applies to changing hearts and minds." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the rhythm of their horses' hooves matching the afternoon breeze that rustled through the sage. Finally, Sarah spoke again. "What you said to Burke about proper representation and testimony, did you mean it?" "Every word," James confirmed. "Got friends in the territorial capital. Judges, newspaper men, people who take a dim view of corruption in law enforcement. If Burke or the sheriff push this, they'll find themselves answering some uncomfortable questions." Sarah nodded, tucking the receipt back into her pocket. She'd keep it, she decided. not as a reminder of shame or anger, but as proof that dignity could be maintained in the face of hatred, that allies could be found in unexpected places, that freedom, once claimed, was worth fighting to defend. The ranch buildings appeared on the horizon. Home, she realized with a start. Not just sanctuary anymore, but truly home. A place worth standing up for, worth facing down prejudice and danger to protect. The receipt might show the worst of human nature, but it also proved that some people like James would stand against that darkness. And maybe that was the real lesson of the day. Not that hatred existed, but that it could be faced and fought, one small battle at a time. The wanted poster made Sarah's blood run cold. Her own face stared back at her, rendered in crude woodblock print, but recognizable enough to anyone who looked closely. Reward, $500 for return of Negro female, age 19 to 20, answers to Sarah, property of Marcus Williams. The paper trembled in her hands as she read the words Luis had brought from town. "They're in Silver Creek," Luis reported grimly, his dark eyes meeting James's across the kitchen table. 3 men asking questions, showing these around. Professional slave hunters by the look of them. "One claimed to be your uncle's agent," he added, glancing at Sarah. James took the poster, studying it with narrowed eyes. Descriptions thorough. Someone's been talking, probably Burke or one of Whitaker's. "Family." His voice was calm, but Sarah saw the tension in his shoulders. How long before they make the connection to the ranch? Day, maybe 2, Luis estimated. Town's full of gossip about the girl staying at McCullough's place. Won't take much to put it together. Sarah's fingers found the river stone in her pocket, its smooth surface anchoring her to the present. "I should go," she whispered, "before they bring trouble to your door." "No." James's response was immediate and firm. "Running. Now would be exactly what they expect. Besides, you'd never make it to California alone. They've probably got men watching all the major trails." He turned to Luis. "Get word to Samuel at the newspaper. Tell him it's time to run that story about corruption in the sheriff's office. And send someone to fetch Judge Matthews. He owes me a favor." Luis nodded and slipped out, leaving Sarah alone with James and her fear. "I won't go back," she said quietly, steel beneath the softness of her voice. "I'll die first." James crossed to the window, checking the yard out of habit. "Won't come to that, but we need to be smart about this." He turned back to her, his expression grave. "Your uncle's involved now. Makes things more complicated. He can claim legal authority as your nearest kin." "He has no authority over me," Sarah spat. "He sold that right along with my freedom." "Courts might see it differently," James cautioned, "but there's more than one way to fight this battle." He retrieved a box from his study, the same one that held his Underground Railroad documents. Time to call in some debts, make some noise that'll draw attention they don't want. The day passed in a blur of preparation. Ranch hands were posted as lookouts. Horses were kept saddled, ready for quick departure. Sarah watched it all with a strange sense of detachment, as if viewing events through clouded glass. That evening, as sunset painted the sky in shades of fire, she found herself in the barn with Maple. The mare nuzzled her pockets for treats as Sarah brushed her coat, the familiar routine soothing her raw nerves. "Your uncle's men are camped at the Silver Creek Hotel," James said from the barn door, his voice carrying quietly in the gathering dark. "Luis just got back. Says they're asking about property rights, trying to get the sheriff's backing for a raid." Sarah's hand stilled on the brush. "And if they come, then they'll find more resistance than they bargained for." James stepped into the barn, his boots quiet on the packed earth. "Judge Matthews will be here by morning. Samuel's running the corruption story in tomorrow's paper. But Sarah," he paused, making sure she met his eyes, "whatever happens, whatever you decide to do, you're not alone in this fight." The wanted poster lay folded in her pocket, a paper ghost of past horrors. But as she stood in the warm barn, surrounded by the honest smells of hay and horse, Sarah felt something stronger than fear. Here, in this place, She was more than a face on a poster, more than property to be claimed. Here, she had found not just sanctuary, but strength, and people willing to stand beside her in the coming storm. Outside, a whip-poor-will called into the deepening dusk, its voice carrying clear and defiant across the darkening land. The legal documents spread across James's study like a paper battlefield. Affidavits, testimonies, and court orders competing for space on the oak desk. Judge Matthews sat in the leather armchair, his wire-rimmed spectacles catching the morning light as he reviewed each page with methodical care. "Your uncle's claim is problematic," the judge said, setting aside one particularly troubling document. "He has testimony from 3 witnesses swearing to his legal guardianship and a bill of sale that appears legitimate on its face." He held up a hand as Sarah started to protest. "I said appears. Fortunately, we have something stronger." From his briefcase, Matthews withdrew a yellowed envelope. "Your parents' freedom papers, filed with the county clerk in Missouri 25 years ago, and their marriage certificate, which lists both as free persons of color. Under territorial law, children of free parents are born free. No subsequent action by a guardian can legally strip that birthright." Sarah's hands shook as she touched the ancient papers. Her father's signature was there, careful and proud, declaring his status as a free man, her mother's mark beside it. She'd never learned to write, but her X was witnessed and notarized. "Where did you find these?" "James had me searching records in 3 states, Matthews replied, nodding toward the rancher who stood by the window. "Your uncle thought he'd destroyed all traces, but government officers have a way of keeping duplicates, especially when someone pays their clerks to be thorough." James turned from his watch position. "So we can prove her free status." "Better than that," Matthews said, lifting another document. "We can prove criminal intent. Your uncle's bill of sale is dated 3 months after he filed papers claiming you died of fever. Can't legally sell a dead woman, which means he knowingly committed fraud. The territorial governor takes a dim view of such things." Sarah sat straighter, hope warring with caution in her chest. "What about the slave hunters? They're still in town, waiting." "Let them wait," James said grimly. "Samuel's story in the paper has the sheriff sweating. Burke's already backing away from any official support of their recovery operation. Without local law enforcement backing them, they're just armed men making threats, and we know how to deal with those." A commotion outside drew their attention. Luis appeared in the doorway, his expression urgent. "Riders coming. 5 of them, armed. Your uncle's with them." James's hand moved to his gun belt, but Judge Matthews held up a staying hand. "Let them. Come. Better to end this legally than add bloodshed to the mix." He gathered the crucial documents, arranging them with deliberate care. "Miss Williams, are you prepared to face your uncle?" Sarah felt the weight of the moment settle around her shoulders. She thought of the river stone in her pocket, of all the strength she'd found since that desperate day by the dry creek. "Yes," she said firmly, "I'm ready to claim my birthright." The confrontation that followed would be talked about in Silver Creek for years to come. Marcus Williams, expecting to find a powerless runaway, instead faced his niece standing tall beside a territorial judge. His bluster about property rights withered under Matthew's precise legal citations and the damning evidence of his own fraud. "This territory may be young," the judge pronounced, his voice carrying to every corner of the ranch yard, "but we're not without law. Miss Williams was born free, lives free, and will remain free. Any man who attempts to change that status will face the full penalty of territorial statute." Sarah watched the color drain from her uncle's face as Matthews detailed the potential charges: fraud, kidnapping, conspiracy. The slave hunters, sensing the shift in winds, began to edge their horses backward. They were businessmen, after all, and this business had suddenly become unprofitable. Marcus made one last attempt, his voice cracking. "She's my blood, my responsibility." "No, Uncle," Sarah replied, her voice clear and steady. "You sold your claim to responsibility along with your humanity. These papers prove what I've always known. I was born free, and free I'll remain. She stood on the porch long after they'd ridden away, the precious documents clutched to her chest. James waited quietly beside her, respecting her need to absorb the moment. "It's really over?" she finally asked. "Legally, yes. Those papers are ironclad. Matthews will file them with every court in the territory. No one can challenge your status now." Sarah nodded, feeling the last chains of her past finally fall away. The future stretched before her, wide and free as the prairie itself. The hand-carved chess set gleamed in the firelight, each piece a testament to patient craftsmanship. Sarah ran her fingers over the white queen, marveling at the delicate crown James had somehow coaxed from raw wood. He'd presented the set to her that morning, a gift to celebrate 2 months of legal freedom. "Catherine taught me the game," James explained, setting up the pieces with careful precision. "Said it was about more than just moving pieces. It was about seeing all the possibilities in front of you." His hands lingered on the Black King, a piece he'd carved to bear a subtle resemblance to himself. "Thought you might like to learn." They sat across from each other at the study's small table, the fire crackling behind them. Through the window, snow fell in lazy spirals, the first storm of winter transforming the ranch into a world of white silence. Sarah studied the board, absorbing the rules as James explained each piece's movement. "The pawns only move forward," she observed, touching one of the small figures. "Like life, no going back, only choosing which way to advance." James smiled, the expression softening the weathered lines of his face. "Except when they reach the other side, then they can become whatever they choose to be, rather like someone else I know." Their eyes met across the board, and Sarah felt the familiar flutter in her chest that had been growing stronger these past weeks. Since the confrontation with her uncle, something had shifted between them, the careful distance of protector, and protected gradually giving way to deeper understanding. "Your move," James said softly, and they both knew he wasn't just talking about the game. Sarah moved a pawn, committing to an opening. "I've been thinking about what happens next. Now that I'm legally free, I mean." She kept her eyes on the board, not trusting herself to meet his gaze. "The offer to help me get to California still stands." "Of course." His voice was carefully neutral as he considered his response to both her move and her words. "If that's what you want, Judge Matthews has friends in Sacramento who could help you start fresh." She advanced another piece, building her position. "That was my plan before. Find somewhere new, where nobody knew my history." She paused, gathering courage. "But plans can change. When you find something worth staying for," the piece in James's hand stilled. "Sarah," there was a wealth of meaning in how he said her name. Hope and hesitation, desire and doubt. "I'm twice your age, and people would talk. People already." "A talk," she replied, finally looking up to meet his eyes. "Let them. I've spent too much of my life worrying about what others think of me." She gestured at the chess set between them. "You gave me this to show me possibilities. Well, I see one I want to explore." James set down his piece without playing it, his expression troubled. "You've known nothing but this ranch these past months. How can you be sure what you want?" "I've known captivity and freedom," Sarah said firmly. "Fear and safety, cruelty and kindness." She reached across the board, her fingers brushing his. "I've known what it is to be property and what it is to be valued as a person. Don't ask me if I'm sure of my own heart." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the snow continued to fall, wrapping the world in contemplative silence. James turned his hand beneath hers, their fingers intertwining. "I've been alone a long time," he said quietly. "Told myself it was better that way, safer." His thumb traced patterns on her palm. "But watching you these past months, your courage, your determination to build a new life, you've woken something in me I thought was long dead." Sarah stood, moving around the forgotten chess game. James rose to meet her, his hands gentle as they framed her face. "No going back," he whispered. No, she agreed, lifting her face to his. Only forward. When their lips met, it felt like a lock clicking open, a door swinging wide to reveal a future neither had dared imagine. The chess pieces stood witness, black and white united on their wooden battlefield, as two souls who had known too much solitude finally found their way to each other. James's six-shooter was a weight of responsibility on Sarah's hip as she moved. Through the pre-dawn darkness, he'd insisted she take it when the first warnings came. Riders spotted watching the ranch from distant ridgelines, strange tracks in the snow around the outlying pastures. "I won't see you taken," he'd said, teaching her how each bullet loaded, how the action worked, not while I draw breath. Now that moment of reckoning had come. Luis's youngest boy had ridden in at midnight, breathless with news. The slave hunters were coming, a dozen strong, led by a man who'd lost too many fees to legal technicalities. They meant to take her, papers or no papers, and damn the consequences. "Back door's clear," James whispered, appearing from the shadows like a ghost. "Luis has the horses ready in the far pasture. If anything happens," he touched her cheek, his rough palm gentle against her skin. "I'm not running," Sarah said firmly. "Not anymore." The gun felt more natural now, an extension of her resolve. "This is our home. We defend it together." Before James could respond, a shout rang out from the ranch's perimeter, Luis's warning signal, followed by the sharp crack of rifle fire. The slave hunters had arrived ahead of schedule, using the last darkness before dawn as cover. Sarah and James moved as one toward the barn, where their main defense was planned. They'd prepared for this, ammunition stored in strategic locations, escape routes mapped out, the high ground secured, but plans had a way of unraveling in the chaos of action. The first rider burst through the gate at a gallop, torch held high. Others followed, their horses' hooves throwing up clods of half-frozen earth. Sarah counted 8, maybe 10, hard men with harder eyes, caring nothing for laws or rights, only the promise of profit. "That's far enough!" James's voice boomed across the yard. He stood in the barn doorway, rifle raised. Luis and 2 ranch hands flanked him, their own weapons ready. "This is private property, and the woman you're seeking is legally free. Turn." "Back now," the lead rider laughed, an ugly sound in the pre-dawn gloom. "Free? Ain't no such thing in these parts. Not when good money's on the table." He raised his torch higher. "Hand her over peaceful-like, and maybe we don't burn this nice ranch to the ground." Sarah stepped into view, James's six-shooter steady in her hand. "The only thing you'll get here is a bullet." Her voice carried clearly in the tense silence. "I suggest you leave while you can." For a moment it seemed reason might prevail. Several riders shifted uneasily in their saddles, perhaps realizing that dead men earned no bounties. But their leader's face twisted with rage at being challenged by a woman, a black woman at that. "Take them!" he roared, spurring his horse. Forward, the yard erupted in gunfire. Sarah's first shot went wide, but her second found its mark, dropping a rider who tried to circle behind the barn. James and Luis held the center, their rifles cracking in disciplined rhythm. The ranch, hands provided covering fire from the hayloft, making each shot count. Through the chaos, Sarah caught glimpses of the battle unfolding, horses rearing, men diving for cover, flames casting wild shadows as the dropped torch set a fence rail ablaze. She moved instinctively to guard James's flank, just as he'd taught her. They fought as partners, each protecting the other, their bond stronger than the fear and fury swirling around them. The turning point came when Luis shot the slave hunter's leader from his saddle. Without his driving rage to unite them, the remaining raiders lost heart. They retreated in 2s and 3s, leaving their dead and wounded behind. Dawn broke over a scarred battlefield. The fence still smoldered, and bullet holes riddled the barn's weathered boards. But the ranch stood, and with it, the life Sarah and James had built together. "It's finished," James said quietly, checking her for injuries. "They won't be back." Not after this kind of beating." Sarah nodded, finally letting her tired arms lower the six-shooter. "No, they won't." The weight of the gun had changed meaning during the fight, no longer just a weapon, but a symbol of her right and ability to defend what was hers. "We protected our home, James agreed, and in those two words lay all the promise of their shared future. The bundle of healing herbs filled the kitchen with their pungent scent as Sarah steeped them in hot water. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, teaching her which plants drew out infection, which eased pain, which promoted healing. The knowledge had been passed down through generations of her family, and now it might save the man she loved. James lay on his bed upstairs, fighting fever from the bullet graze along his ribs. The wound itself wasn't deep, but the cold and stress of the battle had taken their toll. Sarah had been tending him through 2 sleepless nights, applying poultices and whispering prayers into the darkness. "Your mother taught you well," Louise commented from the doorway as she strained the herb-infused water into a clean cup. His own arm was bandaged where a bullet had creased it, but he'd refused to rest. "The fever's lower this morning. Whatever you're doing, it's working." Sarah nodded, adding a spoonful of honey to the bitter medicine. "Mama always said healing wasn't just about the herbs. It was about caring enough to use them right." She gathered her supplies on a tray, the familiar routine keeping her hands steady when her heart wasn't. Any sign of them returning? No. Sheriff's deputy rode out yesterday, took statements about the attack. Even Burke had to admit they were in the wrong, attacking a legal homestead. Louise's dark eyes held approval as he watched her work. "You showed real courage out there." "We all did." Sarah lifted the tray, the herbs releasing wisps of aromatic steam. "Will you check the north pasture fence when you can?" James was worried about the cattle straying through where the fire damaged it. "Already done. Ranch doesn't stop running." Just because he trailed off. But Sarah understood. Just because its owner was injured, just because they'd survived a battle, just because everything had changed while somehow staying exactly the same. Upstairs, James was awake, propped against his pillows. Color had returned to his face, though pain still lined his eyes. "Something smells interesting," he observed as Sarah set the tray down. "Willow bark for the pain, golden seal for infection, and a few other things you probably don't want to know about." She perched on the edge of his bed, helping him sit up straighter. "Drink it all, no arguing." He complied with surprising meekness, grimacing at the taste despite the honey. "Remarkable stuff. Where did you learn about all this?" "My mother." Sarah began changing his bandages with practiced care. She learned from her mother, who learned from hers. Back in Africa, they say our ancestors were healers to kings. Here they healed whoever needed it, slave or free. James caught her hand as she worked, his fingers tangling with hers. "Thank you. Not just for this, but for staying, for fighting. You could have run when they came, found somewhere safer." "Safer than here?" Sarah squeezed his hand gently. "This is where I belong, where we belong." She touched the herbs laid out on the tray, each one carefully chosen and prepared. "These plants, they grow wild in hard places. Tough little things that survive drought and frost. But they have the power to heal. Reminds me of us, in a way. Survivors who found each other," James murmured, his eyes growing heavy as the willow bark began to ease his pain. "Like Catherine said, God puts people in our path for a reason." Sarah hummed agreement, watching as he drifted into healing sleep. Outside, she could hear the normal sounds of ranch life resuming. Louise calling to the hands, cattle lowing in the distance, chickens scratching in the yard. The herb bundle on the tray released its healing scent into the quiet room, linking past and present, old knowledge and new hope. The wounds would heal, she knew. Not just the physical ones, but the deeper hurts they both carried. And when they did, something stronger would remain. A love tempered by fire, a partnership proven in battle, a future built on the foundation of mutual trust and respect. Sarah settled into the chair by James's bed, taking up her vigil once more. There would be more challenges ahead, but they would face them together, drawing strength from each other just as surely as the herbs drew poison from wounds. The architectural plans spread across the kitchen table like a map to the future. James had drawn them himself during his recovery. Careful sketches showing new buildings, expanded corrals, additional sleeping quarters. Sarah traced the lines with her finger, imagining the transformation they represented. The main bunkhouse. Here, James explained, pointing to a detailed drawing, 2 stories, room for at least 20 people. Private quarters for families on the ground floor, dormitory-style spaces above for single folk. His hand moved to another section. Route. Cellar expanded here, new smokehouse beside it. People need to eat and will have to be self-sufficient. Sarah studied the plans, adding her own notes in the margins. We'll need a proper schoolroom, she said, sketching in a small building near the main house. Can't offer sanctuary without offering hope for the future, and a workshop here. People need trades to support themselves once they move on. Their first refugees had arrived 3 days ago, a family of 4 who'd escaped from a plantation in Arkansas. They were staying in the old tack room, converted to temporary quarters until better accommodations could be built. The mothers. Quiet dignity reminded Sarah of her own arrival months ago, while the children's wide-eyed wonder at being able to run free pulled at her heart. Louis says we can start on the bunkhouse next week, James said, making another notation on the plans. Got enough lumber stored, and the hands are willing to help with construction. Judge Matthews is arranging legal papers for our guests, calling them contract workers for the record. Sarah nodded, adding more details to her schoolroom sketch. Mary Beth, the mother, she knows weaving, says she can teach others. And John can work leather better than anyone I've seen. Skills like that, they'll help make the ranch self-supporting. They worked together as the afternoon light faded, refining their vision for this new phase of the ranch's life. The plans became more than just drawings. They were a blueprint for hope, a design for dreams made real in wood and stone and human dignity. It won't be easy, James cautioned, though his eyes were bright with purpose. Word gets around. We'll have more people coming. Some will bring trouble with them. Like I did? Sarah smiled, touching his hand where it rested on the plans. We handled that trouble. We'll handle more if it comes. She looked toward the tack room where the refugee family slept. These people, they're like I was, carrying so much fear, so much hurt, but also so much strength if they're just given a chance to use it. James gathered her close, his arms strong and sure around her. You've changed everything, you know that? This ranch, my life, all of it's bigger now, more purposeful because of you. Sarah leaned into his embrace, remembering her own first night of safety here. We'll need to add a proper infirmary too, she said practically. Can't expect everyone to arrive healthy after long journeys. My herbs help, but we should be prepared for serious care. They worked late into the evening, adding details to their plans, anticipating needs, solving problems before they arose. The lamp burned low as they sketched and debated, erased and revised. Through the window, Sarah could see lights in the tack room, their first guests settling into their first peaceful night's sleep in months. Tomorrow we'll start marking out the foundations, James said finally, rolling up the plans with careful hands. Time to turn these drawings into reality. Sarah nodded, her mind already running ahead to all that needed doing. They'd need help. Trusted allies who understood the importance of secrecy, skilled workers who could build quickly and well, teachers willing to educate without asking too many questions about their students' backgrounds. But looking at the plans, seeing their shared vision taking shape on paper, she felt a surge of certainty. This was right. This was what the ranch had been waiting for, what she and James had been moving toward all along. Not just a sanctuary for 2 wounded souls, but a beacon of hope for others seeking their own paths to freedom. Together, she said softly, touching the rolled plans. We'll build it together. Together, James agreed, and in that word lay all their future's promise. The warning letter arrived by special courier, its expensive paper and formal letterhead declaring its sender's power before Sarah even read the words. From the office of Colonel Jackson Beaumont, Eskinnon, she read aloud, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. James stood at her shoulder, his presence solid and reassuring, as she continued. Be advised that your interference in the lawful recovery of property across territorial lines constitutes a violation of federal statute. The legal language couldn't disguise the threat beneath. Colonel Beaumont was a name they knew. A wealthy plantation owner from Mississippi who'd lost 3 families of slaves to the Underground Railroad in the past year. He's tracked them here, James said grimly, taking the letter for closer examination. Must have followed the same trail we used to get the Williams family to safety last month. He paused at a particular paragraph, his jaw tightening. Says, he's filed papers with the territorial court, claiming we're operating an organized theft ring. Sarah set down her coffee cup, its contents gone cold and forgotten. Through the window, she could see children playing in the new schoolyard, some from free families, others recently escaped, all learning together under the spring sunshine. 6 months of hard work had transformed the ranch into exactly what they'd envisioned, but now it all felt fragile as morning frost. He's coming himself, she noted, pointing to the letter's final lines, bringing sufficient force to rectify this unfortunate situation. That sounds like more than legal action. Beaumont's known for handling things his own way, James agreed. Man's got money and connections all through the South. Local courts tend to see things his way, especially when he brings his own law with him. They'd been expecting something like this, had prepared for it as best they could. The new buildings were designed with hidden spaces, escape routes carefully planned and practiced. But Beaumont's resources and reach threatened to overwhelm their precautions. We should warn everyone, Sarah said, already moving toward the door. Give them the choice to leave before he arrives. James caught her arm gently. And send them where? Winter's coming on, and Beaumont's men will be watching all the major trails. He shook his head. No, we make our stand here, but we do it smart. They spent the afternoon sending riders out with messages to Judge Matthews, to their allies in the newspaper office, to sympathetic ranchers in the area. Sarah worked with Mary Beth to inventory their supplies while James and Louise checked weapons and ammunition. That evening, they gathered everyone in the main house, 37 souls who'd found refuge at the ranch. James laid out the situation plainly, offering each person the choice to leave or stay. Not one chose to go. We've run far enough, Mary Beth declared, her children clustered around her skirts. Time to stand and fight for what's right, Sarah. Watch their faces in the lamplight. Former slaves and free folk, all united in their determination to defend their newfound home. The warning letter sat on the mantelpiece, its threat diminished by the strength of community gathered before it. Beaumont thinks he's dealing with a handful of troublemakers, she said quietly to James as the meeting broke up. He doesn't understand what we've built here. No, James agreed, squeezing her hand. He doesn't, and that's going to be his biggest mistake. Outside, the autumn wind carried the promise of winter, but inside the ranch house, the warmth of shared purpose kept the cold at bay. They had 3 days until Beaumont's promised arrival. 3 days to prepare for the fight that would determine not just their future, but the future of every soul who sought sanctuary in this hard, beautiful land. The Freedom Papers lay spread across Judge Matthews' desk in the Silver Creek courthouse, their crisp legal language a stark contrast to the tension filling the room. Colonel Beaumont stood rigid with fury, his expensive coat dusty from the ride, as the territorial judge read the documents aloud. By order of the Territorial Supreme Court, all persons currently residing at the McCullough Ranch are hereby declared legally free, their prior status notwithstanding. Matthews's voice carried the weight of law as he continued. Furthermore, any attempt to remove said persons by force shall constitute a violation of territorial statute. Sarah stood beside James, her back straight, watching Beaumont's face darken. Outside the courthouse windows, she could see his men, 20 hard-faced mercenaries who'd expected an easy raid on a remote ranch. Instead, they'd found themselves facing not just the law, but a united community. "This is absurd," Beaumont spat. "Those are my people. I have bills of sale, contracts, which hold no legal weight in this territory," Matthews interrupted. "Not since Governor Stevens signed the new statute this morning. Any person who reaches these lands is presumed free unless proven otherwise through due process of law." The documents James had been gathering for months had finally served their purpose. Evidence of Beaumont's illegal slave-hunting operations, testimony from escaped souls who'd suffered under his ownership, proof of bribery and corruption, all carefully compiled and presented to the territorial government. "You can't do this," Beaumont snarled, his cultured veneer cracking. "Do you know who I am? The connections I have? We know exactly who you are," James said quietly. "That's why we made sure everything was completely legal. Your connections won't help you here, Colonel. Not anymore." Sarah stepped forward, holding out one final document. "This is a list of every person you've claimed as property in the past 5 years. The territorial marshal is very interested in investigating their current status." Her voice was calm, but her eyes held steel. "Leave now with your men, and we'll consider the matter closed. Stay and face the consequences of your actions." Beaumont's hand twitched toward his gun, but the movement died as he registered the armed deputies positioned around the courthouse. This wasn't the vulnerable ranch he'd expected to terrorize into submission. This was a trap, carefully laid and legally binding. "This isn't over," he growled, snatching his hat from the judge's desk. "You can't change the natural order of things." "The natural order is freedom," Sarah replied. "Everything else is just men's greed wrapped in false righteousness." They watched from the courthouse steps as Beaumont and his men rode out of Silver Creek, their defeat evident in slumped shoulders and bitter faces. The freedom papers in Sarah's hand caught the afternoon sunlight, their official seals glinting like promises kept. "It worked," she breathed, still hardly daring to believe it. Months of preparation, countless letters and legal petitions, the careful building of alliances, all coming together in this moment of triumph. James squeezed her hand. "Of course it worked. Truth has a way of prevailing when people stand together to defend it." Judge Matthews joined them, his usual stern expression softened by satisfaction. "You've done more than save your people," he said. "You've helped establish a precedent that will protect others seeking sanctuary in these territories. The law's on your side now, fully and formally." Sarah thought of everyone waiting back at the ranch. Families who'd risked everything for freedom, children who'd never known chains, a community built on hope and courage. The freedom papers in her hands weren't just for them, they were for all who would come after, seeking refuge and finding home. The wedding ring caught the spring sunlight as Judge Matthews placed it in James's weathered palm. Simple gold, inscribed with 2 words, "Forever Free." Sarah had chosen the inscription herself, marking both her journey to freedom and her choice. To bind herself to this man, this life, this purpose. The ranch's courtyard bloomed with wildflowers, their colors echoing the patchwork quilt that served as a makeshift wedding canopy. Every resident of their growing sanctuary had contributed something to this day. Mary Beth had sewn Sarah's dress, the children had gathered flowers, Luis had prepared a feast that would feed the 100+ guests gathered to witness their union. "The ring you're about to exchange," Matthews intoned, his judicial gravity softened by genuine warmth, "represents not just your love for each other, but the sacred circle of community you've built here, a circle that grows stronger with each soul who finds refuge within it." Sarah stood tall beside James, her father's freedom papers tucked into her bodice near her heart, her mother's riverstone secure in her pocket. The old Catherine had watched over their courtship from her photograph. Now her memory blessed their union through the gifts she'd left behind. The journal where Sarah had learned to write, the chess set where she and James had first acknowledged their feelings, When James slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands were steady, but his eyes shone with emotion. Sarah's voice was clear and strong as she spoke her vows, promising to stand beside him in all things, to continue building their shared dream of sanctuary and justice. "What we've created here," James said softly for her ears alone, "is more than I ever dreamed possible. You've given me back my purpose, my heart, my future, and you've given me the freedom to choose that future," Sarah replied, squeezing his hands together. As Judge Matthews pronounced them married, the gathered community erupted in joy. Former slaves and free folk, ranch hands and townspeople who'd come to support their cause, all celebrating not just a union of two hearts, but the triumph of love over hatred, of hope over fear, of freedom over bondage. The ranch sign stood proud at the entrance gate, its fresh paint gleaming in the morning sun. "Freedom Ranch, all are welcome." 20 years had passed since Sarah first collapsed by that dry creek bed, and the sanctuary she and James had built had grown beyond their wildest dreams. The original buildings had been joined by dozens more. Dormitories, workshops, classrooms, where children of all colors learned side by side. The ranch had become a legend throughout the territories, a beacon of hope for those seeking refuge from bondage and persecution. Sarah stood at the gate, her silver-streaked hair caught by the wind, watching a new family approach along the road. James's steady presence beside her felt as natural as breathing. Their own children, 2 daughters and a son, helped run the ranch now, carrying forward the legacy of both Catherine's compassion and Sarah's fierce determination. The river stone still rode in her pocket, smooth and warm, a reminder of how far she'd come, but it was no longer just her talisman. It had become a symbol passed from hand to hand among new arrivals, a touchstone for those making the journey from slavery to freedom, from fear to hope, from solitude to community. "Welcome home," Sarah called to the approaching family, and watched as their weary faces lit with the same joy she'd felt when she first found sanctuary in this beautiful, unforgiving land.